Good afternoon, everybody. So, the last session you looked at, hopefully, was related to the idea of development. This session is related to who are the players and the motivations in the sort of field of international development. Now, most of you, if you've been working with World Vision for a while, have sort of developed a sort of intuitive sense of a large variety of the categories and people and so forth that are on the scene. But this is just to sort of put it into the sort of larger context. Okay, there's four sort of general classes of players who are on the scene. The first class, I've already mentioned two players who are related to that. I call the multi-laterals. Now, the multilaterals are organizations that are comprised of multiple countries as members. So, for example, the United Nations is the classic example of a multilateral. Looks like I should be making this bigger. So, multilaterals. The United Nations. Another famous one would be the IMF or the World Bank. These are all these very large supra-entity organizations that are engaged in international development. Now, the UN has a whole bunch has 27 different sub-agencies that are related to the United Nations. Of these, ones that you will have heard of would be UNICEF, the World Health Organization, possibly you've heard of that one, or the United Nations Development Program. As I said, or the World Food Program. There's about 27 of different of these, but they would all sort of be combined under this category called multilaterals. Now, as the World Bank and the IMF emerged right after World War II, the United Nations also emerged right after World War II. Well, there had been an original sort of League of Nations that had sort of fallen apart during the World Wars. So when we're looking at this sort of scene of multilaterals, almost all of these organizations relate back to or began around the end of World War II. Shortly after World War II, through the 1950s was when these organizations sort of first began, or first emerged. One organization that has emerged relatively recently that's part of these multilaterals is called the World Trade Organization. This was formed in the mid-90s, and it is another multilateral of the sort of same context, that its purpose is to regulate trade agreements between nations. So, what is the motivations of these organizations? Now, obviously, if you're talking to anybody who's specifically working in the organization, I'm trying to draw little people here working inside WFP or UNICEF, they will have their own sort of personal motivations around addressing poverty, injustice, development, and so forth. But as systems, what these organizations are primarily created for is to maintain stability. So I'm going to put big words here, stability. What I mean by that is that, for example, the IMF was created in order to ensure that countries paid back their loans so that there was no sort of economic collapse such as the Great Depression. The World Bank was created in order to rebuild Europe so as to avoid the economic hardships and resentment that gave rise to Nazism. So if you think about it, both of these organizations were developed in order to prevent collapses into either major social chaos or war. The same with the United Nations, of course. So all of these sub-agencies that are working underneath these, they might have their own specific agendas, but really these organizations are intended to promote global stability. And these organizations take the idea that global stability is good for everybody. Like, too much chaos is a bad thing, too much war, obviously, I think very few people disagree with that. But it is important because it's not the same motivation, for example, that an organization like World Vision might have. So I'll come to that in a second. So this is one group of players, the multilaterals. All right, the second group that I would talk about, see if the red is any more brighter, is what I call the bi-laterals. And I guess you can see, the bilaterals are governmental organizations. So they are departments of specific governments whose purpose is to do development in some other country. So to invest in development projects in a different country. The most famous one that you probably know about is United States Agency for International Development, USAID. So this is a department of the United States whose mandate is to give money to countries, let's say like Nigeria or Albania, to further their development programs. So they're called bilaterals because these agencies create bilateral agreements between nations. So United States, Albania, United States, Nigeria, but they're one-on-one. Other organizations like this would be the Canadian International Development Agency, the Japanese Development Agency, DFID, I can't remember how DFID is spelled, the United Kingdom, the European Union, EU grants are a big thing right now in World Vision Albania. That would be considered a bilateral. It's a bilateral of a very big organization, but they're doing bilateral agreements. So there's a whole bunch of these. Almost every what you would call wealthy country in the world has an aid agency that is part of its governmental structure. USAID is by far the biggest. It has an annual budget of about $20 billion a year. But every country has one. The Norwegians, the Swedes, Germans, you name a wealthy country, they have one of the Australia. AusAid is another country or organization that does a lot of investment in Eastern Europe, although not so much in Albania. But so these would be sort of what they would primarily do is give large amounts of money to governments or to NGOs to implement development programming within a country. Okay. So the bilaterals, what's their motivation? Well, if you are a good cynical citizen, you quite right away thought of what the bilaterals are primarily motivated by. Again, the individuals in the organization may have their own particular personal views, but the organization itself is primarily motivated by the political interest of the host of the country, of the government. So, for example, USAID. Let's take the United States. It may not surprise you to know that most of USAID investment right now is either in Israel, Egypt, Iraq, or Afghanistan. So, you would say, these are countries that seem to have a lot of political interest right now with the United States. The UK grants tend to go to former colonies that are of political interest to the United Kingdom. But all of the aid that is linked out of bilaterals is connected in some way to the political interests of that particular government. So you can get a sense of what are the political interests or what are the shifting interests of a particular government by looking at the distribution of their aid around the world. For example, is the UK investing more in Kazakhstan all of a sudden, or in Asia? If they are, that suggests something about the shifting political interests of the UK. Again, they would be working. Organizations like USAID have programs. Almost every country in the world has some level of investment from USAID. But for example, in Albania, it's a very tiny amount compared to, for example, what you would see if you were visiting Nigeria, for example, or some of those other important countries such as Israel, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so forth. Okay. The third category is a very general category, and it basically is anything that is not one of the other two. But the NGOs, non-governmental organizations. There are so many NGOs and such a wide variety of them that these are actually, NGOs tend to be broken down into lots of different subcategories. But basically these are private development organizations, meaning they do not belong to any government or supra-government entity. They are owned, as it were, by individuals or private institutions, such as churches. They're private organizations that are engaging in development work of some sort. Now, under the subcategories, we have INGOs, which are international non-governmental organizations. These would be organizations that have their headquarters in one country, but have programs throughout the world. And World Vision is an NGO, is an INGO. CARE, Save the Children, Terre des Hommes, just to name a few that you may be familiar with in your context. These are INGOs. Now, national NGOs are organizations that are based in a country and work throughout that particular country. FBSH, Famille de Bota Sechiperi, it would be an example of a national NGO in Albania. Local NGOs work only in a specific region or context. And again, one that you may have heard about is MedPAC in Librajde. It's primarily focused on areas around Librajde. And then you have CBOs, community-based organizations, that only work at the level of, or organized around the level of a community. Excuse me. So, this is a big, okay, how many NGOs are there in the world? If we asked it that way. Let's take a small category, INGOs. That's the biggest category. World Vision is the biggest INGO in the world. It has a budget of about $2 billion a year. But there's lots and lots of other ones. How many do you think there are in the world? I'll pause while you think. Okay, you probably guessed low. Nobody knows the exact number because nobody is required to organize these around all of the different countries. Germany, France, UK, United States, Australia, Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, all of these countries, all of the wealthy countries are the bases of lots of INGOs. But I've heard estimates of about 50 to 75,000 INGOs around the world. Now, World Vision, I said, is the biggest, but there's a lot of others. At the level of national NGOs, the estimate is in the millions of national level NGOs that operate within different countries. So the overall number of these sort of private organizations that are engaged in development, we're talking probably maybe 5 to 10 million different organizations around the world. So there's a lot of organizations out there that are in this category of private, non-governmental organizations working at these different levels. Now, what is the motivation of these organizations? Well, in general, you would say that, well, I mean, you can be cynical, but let's just say systematically, the idealized motivation is humanitarian or religious interests. So, for example, World Vision emerged as a result of Bob Pierce being exposed to impoverished children in Korea as a result of the Korean War. So he was over there as a soldier, saw all these children, got to love the Korean context, etc., and came home and got with a group of his friends and said, we have to help these Korean children. The Mennonite Central Committee, who I currently work for, had a similar story about, but it was during the Russian Revolution, and it was targeting Russian Mennonites who were starving as a result of the war and the famine. And so on and so forth. I see I'm running out of time here. I want to try to keep these at about 15 minutes each. So almost all of these INGOs were formed because somebody had a vision or a sort of passion for trying to make a difference in somebody's lives. So in many ways, the humanitarian religious interests here are the primary motivations for how these NGOs got started. Now, of course, they often are also struggling to survive, so they have a lot of different strategies to do for survival. But at heart, they have a sort of humanitarian focus, which is different from the bilaterals and the multilaterals. So what sometimes gets complicated is if you have multilaterals funding NGOs. Well, the NGOs are motivated by humanitarian interests. The multilaterals are largely motivated by sort of trying to ensure stability. So sometimes this relationship doesn't always work because of these different motivations. Also with the bilaterals, let's say you have the EU funding an NGO in Albania, there's certain things that this bilateral is wanting, but it's often related to the political interests of the particular country. Whereas the NGO may be more motivated by sort of other issues or agendas. So sometimes those don't cross-link either. It's one reason why many NGOs have been suspicious of. They'll take bilateral and multilateral funding because there's a lot of money out there, but they've often felt sort of compromised when they do it, because they intuitively or instinctively understand that there are different motivations behind these different layers. The last group I won't spend much time on, but there's a lot of what I'll call donors. I'll call private donors. So foundations that give money to NGOs, different levels of NGOs to engage in development. So the Rockefeller Foundation, Rockefeller, the Ford Foundation, Winrock International. Again, there's many different types of foundations. They are all, the Soros Fund would be one that you may know in Eastern Europe, more familiar because George Soros has a lot of investments now in Eastern Europe. So the Soros Fund would be another one. These foundations primarily fund NGOs, and these foundations to a large extent align very closely with NGOs in terms of motivations. They're motivated by humanitarian or religious interests, so they would be different from the bilaterals and multilaterals in terms of how they fund. So the Soros Foundation is probably a more happy alignment with some of the NGO motivations than, for example, the European Union would be, just because of where they happen to be located there. All right, I think I will stop there. This is just a quick outline of the players that are on the scene. I would encourage you to think about, in your context, which ones of these have you run up against? Which ones of these have you heard about? Which ones haven't you heard about? Which ones are not in your context? Okay, and for the next session after this.